Thanks for coming. Donald Stoker is professor of strategy and policy at the U.S. Naval War College in Monterey at the Naval Postgraduate School. He's the author of, or editor of 7 books, including a book on the Civil War, The Grand Design, Strategy in the Civil War, which won the 2010 Fletcher Pratt Award. Today he's going to tell us about Clausewitz, which many of you have heard of. The most famous quote is, war is the continuation of policy by other means. But I think he's going to tell us there's more to him than that, which is good because the book is kind of hard to read. I've tried reading Clausewitz and didn't get too far. So with that, let's welcome Donald Stoker.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Bob, and I thank Google for inviting me. It's a good opportunity for me. And I have to start with my disclaimer because I'm a federal employee, that everything I say is my opinion and not that of the United States government or any branch or association thereof. And I'm going to talk to you just a little bit this morning about Karl von Clausewitz. And the class, I teach a class called Strategy in War, and we talk about Clausewitz the theorist. And one of the things I have to overcome with my students, some of the students, the mid-grade officers, is there's a reluctance sometimes to study theory, and sometimes their reluctance is with good reason. But if they've ever heard of Clausewitz, or if anyone's ever heard of him, obviously is the author of On War, and that's certainly what he is most where he's been most influential. But Clausewitz was also a soldier, and this is sometimes forgotten in the discussion of his ideas and of his life, and it gives him a little more credibility to some of my students who have often been deployed 9 or 10 times to Iraq, Afghanistan, or sundry other entertaining places, when they realize that, yeah, this is a guy that he's not just a theorist, some like a professor like me up there just spouting things to them. He's a guy who actually had done something as well. And to me, you can't separate his experience as a soldier from his writing as a theorist, because the both things are so intertwined. And so Clausewitz, again, he was a soldier, and a soldier with an enormous amount of experience. He was probably in 36, either in or present at least 36 battles. I think it was more, but it's difficult to decisively determine that from the source material I could find. Father was a soldier. He grew up in the country of Prussia, which is the country, as you guys know, eventually unifies Germany. And he goes into the Army probably at age 11. There's some argument over his birth date. And this is not actually unusual for this time period. In British Navy, famously, kids went to sea 8, 9, 10 years old. So the child soldier has been with us for a long time. It's not just a scourge we see today. And he fights in all 5 of these wars here. And this is essentially, in some ways, an outline for some of the stuff I'm going to talk about to you. Because I want to talk about why these things matter for his development, and hopefully why it matters for what he eventually gives us. And there are several strong influences, obviously, in his life and influence his writing as well. And one of the most important is the French Revolution in 1789, when the French revolutionaries revolt, overthrow the king, eventually execute him. And you see a situation where, because of the French Revolution, you overturn the political and military apple carts and social apple cart in many ways of Europe, and particularly the way warfare, for our purposes, is what's important, the way warfare is done. Armies go from being small, fairly small, relatively professional, to having mass armies fed by conscription and fed by large elements of the state. And you see this unleashing of the passion of the citizen, the passion of the people, as Clausewitz himself calls it, to harness to war, whereas the people have been kind of pushed aside, and war was the realm of the army and the king and the princes. It becomes the role of the people as well. And from this French revolutionary experience rises up one of Clausewitz's other influences in many ways, this man here, Napoleon Bonaparte, who becomes, because of his own skill, the opportunities he has, and just his brilliance as well, and co-opting this wonderful French military machine that develops, becomes the master of Europe. And you can see what Clausewitz says about him. Calls him the god of war himself, the most determined general the world has ever seen. He doesn't like Napoleon's politics, but he admires, respects Napoleon's military skill, and wants to, well, why is this guy so good, at what he does? Well, Clausewitz goes off to his first war in January of 1793. Remember, he's born in 1780. And this campaign is essentially one of the first revolutionary wars, where it's essentially Prussia and Austria fighting the French, and there's some other little countries, smaller states involved. And the French revolutionaries had essentially ended up eventually at war with most of Europe, to boil it down. But he'll participate in the siege of this city of Mainz, and he'll help attack some of the fortifications here. Following this will be a campaign in the Vosges area. It's a really rugged campaign. Clausewitz says it almost kills him. He's 12, 13 years old, when this is going on. There are two other officer cadets in the unit that are young like him. That they both are killed. They both die as a result of the rigors of the campaign, and he almost dies as well in a couple of places, and his position he's in one time is overrun. But what does this tell us, though, about him? Well, it's important for his development. The experience that he gets from this always lives with him. He refers to this later on, the events that happens here. But he also, reflecting on it later, he talks about just how confused he was. He never really knew what was just physically going on. But also, intellectually, he didn't understand, why are we here? What are we doing? What is the point of all of this? Why is this war being fought? And that puzzled him, and he really wanted to know and understand these things. And after this, he never had any education, growing up, or very little education, just some in the local school. When you go into the Army at age 11, you haven't had much time for graduate school. So he's posted on a village family and a peasant family for a little while, and here's a library nearby, and he begins to read, and he discovers the Enlightenment, discovers education, and becomes a voracious reader. It's posted to another command where it's the commander of the base he's at is very much interested in the education of his officers and his men, and even of the men's families, as well, and he has a garrison school and so on. And here he really falls in love with learning and really starts to blossom here, and gets himself an appointment to one of the officer training schools, officer schools in Berlin. And this becomes a pivotal thing as far as his development for his career, but also in why we get on war. Because here in Berlin, he graduates first from his class, and he ends up with a mentor named Scharnhorst, who is this gentleman here, Gerhard von Scharnhorst, who runs the school. And Clausewitz is his star pupil. Scharnhorst, he teaches Clausewitz how to think, in many ways, which is what is critical. Scharnhorst very much believed in critical analysis, where you look at something ruthlessly, cut away the stuff that's not true, cut away the stuff that doesn't make sense, and when you look at past events, you try to get solid history on it, understand what was really going on. Don't let your own deceptions and perceptions confuse you. Try to get at what is the truth. And Scharnhorst also gets him his next job, as well as an adjutant to one of the Prussian princes. And through that, he meets this woman here, a lady named Marie von Brühl, who eventually become his wife. She's a very intelligent, articulate woman, very well read, very much his intellectual equal, from a much more distinguished family than Clausewitz. Marie's mother, widowed mother, is not so approving of the relationship. It actually takes them 7 years to wear Madame von Brühl down to where she'll actually agree to let them get married, because she's like, this young officer without any land or maybe doesn't have much career prospects. She's kind of skeptical. So as a father of a daughter, I kind of understand. Who's your daughter going to marry here? So, but also at the same time, he begins to write. And this is important as well. So we're already starting to see, when he's 23, 24 years old, what we're going to eventually see partially in On War. Now, in 1806, Clausewitz will march off to his second war. Now, why does this matter? Well, Clausewitz has become very ambitious. And he's in a country, Prussia, where being a soldier matters. This is important. And he is a soldier. What matters to be a successful soldier is to prove yourself, to have success in warfare. And in his view, this is the way that he can make it for himself. He says, he says something along the lines of, my country needs war and I do too. The ambition is driving him here for this. What you have happen in 1806 is essentially where Napoleon, who's the master of most of Europe, he invades the country of Prussia. And you end up with this two-pronged invasion of Prussia that is by the French, which is met by two Prussian armies. You will fight two battles, Jena and Auerstedt. the French will decisively win both of these battles, and they will win the war because of it. Now, Clausewitz will fight at this Battle of Jena, the Battle of Auerstedt, right here. And his unit is the rear guard, meaning the Prussians had essentially already lost the battle. The unit he is in is committed as part of the rear guard. And they fight their way into the city of Popple and then fight their way out. And his boss, Prince August, is wounded 3 times. Likely wounded 3 times in this attack, which shows you the intensity, gives a glimpse of the intensity of what is going on here. And then what you have after this is a 14-day fighting retreat, where you can see from the map here, roughly Clausewitz's unit follows this blue line, essentially. And eventually they're forced to surrender near the city of Prenzlau after a 3-hour firefight. And Prussia essentially comes apart, during this. And Clausewitz is shipped off to France, as a prisoner of war with Prince August. And now, when Americans, most of us today, if we think anything about prisoners of war, we think about Andersonville, or we think about Stalag, 17, or maybe Stalag 13 if you're watching old Hogan's Heroes reruns. But, we don't think about the experience that he has as an officer, and an officer that serves an aristocrat. They're posted to a village outside Paris. They spend a couple weeks in Paris. They go to Switzerland and hang out in Madame de Stael's salon, one of the famous intellectuals of the day. Go visit the glacier. It's very much a gilded imprisonment, to say the least. He hates every minute of it, and complains about it all the time because the war is still going on. He's missing a chance to make a name for himself. But when the war's over, he's sent back to Prussia. And here, he gets involved in the Prussian reform movement. What this is, and briefly, is Prussia was shattered by this war. Prussia before the war, Prussia after the war. The French essentially take half their country. The Prussians know they've got to change how they do things. They've got to tap into this nationalist sentiment that the French had tapped into. They've got to make the Prussian people more supportive of the Prussian state, give them an interest in the state. They've got to reform the army. They've got to reform the government. Clausewitz is very heavily involved in this. He also becomes an instructor at what becomes their war college, and he also begins to write, as well during this period, and starts developing some of the ideas that he'll eventually they'll eventually show up in On War. But also he sees by 1812 the way the political winds are blowing, and he sees that Prussia is forced into an alliance with France. France is about to invade Russia. Clausewitz doesn't want to participate in anything under the French flag. He hates Napoleon. He admires Napoleon's military skill, but he hates him politically. And he doesn't want anything to do with this. He thinks that Prussia should rise up and fight. And so he writes this gigantic political declaration, which boils down to a cry, in many ways of violence to rise up and fight against France. But also he says some not nice things about a lot of the ruling elites in the Prussian political system, which wins him a lot of enemies and a lot of bad blood, and eventually he just resigns from the army, in the midst of all of this, from the Prussian army. And a lot of other officers do as well, because there are a lot of other officers, a few dozen others that feel the same way. And what he will do now is go to his next war, and the war of the 1812 invasion of Russia. If anyone knows anything about the Napoleonic period, they usually have heard of this and usually know something about this campaign, where essentially Napoleon tries to defeat the Russians it would make him master of Europe, essentially, if he does this, at least of the continent. Clausewitz is involved in this campaign from the first day it starts to the very bitter end of it. And it's just a gruesome bloodletting the entire time. And everyone knows about how bad the winter is on the troops here. But the summer is also pretty grueling on it. Essentially, you have a French invasion, and the Russians retreat in the face of the French invasion. Clausewitz initially is on one of an extended version of the Tsar's staff through his connections with various officers and politicians. But he doesn't want to do this. He wants to have a posting where he'll see some action because, again, here's the ambition. He wants to make a name for himself. He says, I'm going to Russia to make a name for myself. I can't do it on this staff. And so he ends up fighting in several rear guard actions because that's where you can make a name for yourself, because he gets posted to the rear guard. Eventually, he will participate in the Battle of Borodino. As the French advance, the Russians decide, well, here's where we have to fight them, see if we can stop them. And he's fortunate in this battle in the sense that he misses the worst of the bloodletting of it. You can see it's about 130,000 men involved. You have 65,000 casualties. It's a serious slugfest. You have French troops attacking Russian positions. Clausewitz is involved in the cavalry attack that the Russians try to launch on this flank here, and they have a firefight with some some French and Croatian troops here. Essentially, the Russians fight them to a standstill. They begin their retreat toward Moscow again. Clausewitz goes back to the rear guard, has a horse shot out from under him in one action on the way to Moscow. He sees the famous burning of Moscow. He's in one of the last units that go through that. And after this, though, he gets himself posted to yet another unit. They're constantly shuffling him around from different places. He's supposed to go work in this unit called the Russo-German Legion as one of the staff officers for that. It's a unit that the Russians were forming from German exiles like him and from prisoners of war. They were doing it for political reasons. But the unit is not put together yet, so he doesn't want to sit around, and so he gets himself posted to work for a man named Wittgenstein. Now, what has happened here? This is one of the famous events of the Russian invasion, Napoleon's crossing of the Berezina. It's well known for just the harshness of the weather and the messiness of it, the casualties of it, and the destruction, very much the destruction of Napoleon's army. What the Russians tried to do, they have an army under Wittgenstein, an army under Kutuzov, an army under Chichagov, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that one, and they're trying to catch Napoleon's army. Napoleon fights his way through them and gets away, but the destruction here at the crossing of the river is enormous, and you can see from, I'm not going to read the letter for you, but Clausewitz experiences very much this. But also in the wake of this, as the French are retreating, he will get the opportunity to make a very significant impact on warfare during the Napoleonic period, or the shape of it, but not in the way he wants. He wants to make a name for himself as a soldier, as a combat soldier, make a name for himself in the field. He's very ambitious. But what will happen is, as the French and their other allied troops are retreating from Russia, the unit that Clausewitz is in will make contact with the Prussian Expeditionary Corps. Now, you remember the Prussians had been forced to ally with France to invade Russia, but the Prussians had been forced to commit an army to help them do this. As Napoleon is retreating, the Prussian troops are also retreating in a different part of Russia. Clausewitz's unit comes in contact with this. He worked for this man here named Diebitsch, and Diebitsch says, hey, talk to them and see if you can get them to change sides. And other Russians had been trying to do this. Clausewitz talks to them, and after a couple of days of conversations, and there's certainly some willingness a lot of the Prussians didn't want to be here anyway, they agree to change sides essentially in the war. And this is a pivotal, pivotal thing for the Napoleonic period, because it shifts the alliance structure in what is going on here. This is the thing, arguably, that in his military career that Clausewitz accomplishes that is the most important thing. Because what you will have happen on the tail of this is you will have yet Clausewitz's next war. And this is a gigantic campaign in 1813 and 1814 with an armistice in the middle, which is a campaign that will eventually lead to the first overthrow of Napoleon. Clausewitz, he tries to get back in the Prussian army. The king isn't real happy, with what he's done. And the king tells him essentially, well, fight in this campaign. We'll see how you do, and then we'll talk about it afterwards. So, with his old friend, he gets himself detailed to his old friend Scharnhorst here, who is essentially the chief of staff for the Prussian army here. And so he goes to the staff as a Russian liaison officer. So technically he's still in the Russian army, but he's back with all the people that he knew from before. And he will help fight in this campaign, and he will also help plan this campaign. And one of the places where he will fight is the Battle of Lutzen here, which is it's a real slugfest. The Napoleon, the French commander, defeats the Russian Prussian army that comes against him. Clausewitz calls this the most memorable day of his life. And he says this, I think, one, because of the intensity of the battle. The sides were so mixed in, and the Prussians and the Russians, essentially the entire staff, which normally would not have participated, is also fighting hand-to-hand at times in this battle. And Clausewitz is hit on the side of the head with a bayonet in what was probably a cavalry charge against a French infantry square, certainly a French infantry unit. That would make it memorable to me, if I'd been hit on the head with a bayonet. What you will see after the armistice is a gigantic campaign that the Austrians who enter the war, the Prussians and the Russians will then launch through central Germany and into France that will eventually lead to Napoleon's downfall. But to Clausewitz, this is kind of a disappointing campaign in a couple senses. One, the primary campaign is through central Germany and into France. He is posted up here into the northern part of Germany. Here's the city of Hamburg, province of Mecklenburg, through what is very much a peripheral part of the war. He's very upset by this. He tries to get this reversed. He doesn't. They won't let him back into the Prussian army, so he's still technically in the Russian army. So he's put in this multinational force fighting in northern Germany. The coalition warfare here is extremely complex and confusing. You have so many different countries involved in it. But to boil it down, what has happened is this man here was a former French marshal, very important officer in the French army. It's a man named Bernadotte. He becomes the crown prince of Sweden. The other countries, the Prussians, the Russians, the Austrians, want him to bring Sweden into the war. He says, okay, I'll bring Sweden into the war against Napoleon. I want Norway. Okay, you can have Norway. Well, Norway belongs to Denmark. Okay, so we have to invade Denmark for you to get Norway. So it's just rolling. This is the way business is done. They trade countries around like they're poker chips. And so Clausewitz ends up in this army that's Bernadotte's army, but he ends up working for this man named Walmoden in Walmoden's corps. Walmoden's corps is in some of the units, the most oddest units. He's got Russians and Prussians and various Germans. The unit that Clausewitz is technically a part of, I looked at their rosters. It's supposed to be the Russo-German Legion. It's got some Germans in it. It's got some Russians in it. It's got Frenchmen, Italians, Poles, and I even found a couple of Americans, listed on the roster. So it had obviously not what it was originally intended to be. But why does this campaign matter here is the most important thing? Well, again, one, Clausewitz is ambitious. He wants to make a name for himself. How do you make a name for yourself in the peripheral theater? He's very much angered by that. But what will happen here is they will fight a campaign through here into the northern part of Germany and southern part of Denmark. And there will be a battle here, a tiny battle from the Napoleonic period at a town called Zeestedt. And here, what happens is Clausewitz's unit is surprised by the Danish army, and the Danes kick them around pretty hard. And after this is what matters, because this worries Clausewitz. Yes, they were defeated and it's bad and the casualties are bad, but there are two things that come out of it that matters. One, this is a defeat. This injures their reputation of their corps. He worries how this is going to affect his future and how the embarrassment this causes. Defeat is not good. Secondly, one of the things he writes after the battle, he writes a letter, one of his letters, he says, the intelligence we had all said the Danes weren't there. Now, in On War, he's very critical in parts of his book On War about intelligence. He's very skeptical about it. Now, can you draw a direct connection between this one event and that? I would say that would be very difficult to do. I would say it's more of an example of his experience, because so much of the time he is the chief staff officer. He's the guy handling the intelligence. So I think some of it is that. They finish up this campaign in Holland and Belgium. Not a lot dramatic happens after this, and Napoleon is deposed. But then Clausewitz goes to his fifth war, again. And Napoleon escapes, comes back to France, becomes Emperor of France again for a short time. The various countries he was at war with before mobilize against him. And what you will see is one of the other most famous campaigns of the Napoleonic period, the Waterloo campaign. And Clausewitz does not fight in the Battle of Waterloo itself, but he fights in a couple of other places during the campaign. One at the Battle of Ligny. Here, he is Chief of Staff for Thielmann's Corps, 3rd Corps of the Prussian Army. He's back in the Prussian army. They finally let him back in. And so he fights in this Battle of Ligny. His unit is not committed very heavily there. They're mostly used as a reserve. But when the Prussian army is defeated here by Napoleon and comes apart, he has this harrowing retreat where he's almost overrun by French cavalry and they have to march all night through the rain. But then they will fight, right after this, they will fight the Battle of Wavre. Now, why does Wavre matter? Well, here you have Waterloo, where Napoleon is defeated. Here you have the Battle of Wavre. This battle matters for a couple of reasons. One, because they tied down a lot of the troops, a whole corps that Napoleon could have had in support of Waterloo. And if he'd had those men at Waterloo, maybe then the battle goes differently. Maybe not, but maybe it does. And this is considered critical. For Clausewitz, it's the worst night of his life. They fight a 2-day battle here against a superior force. They're defeated here and forced to retreat. And Clausewitz's wife writes later about why he thought this was such a bad day. Well, in his mind, why it was such a worst night of his life, because he knows now he's not going to get the chance to ever get the military glory that he wants. He's not going to have it, because they've learned during their battle that Napoleon has been severely defeated. They know, yes, the war will go on for a few more weeks, but it's not going to be, the conclusion is pretty foregone at this point. Now, what happens after this? 1815, Napoleon is deposed. Clausewitz will have a couple of jobs in the Prussian army after this, but in 1818 he goes to be the director of the Prussian War College. And this is primarily an administrative job, and so it gives him time to write. He's always been writing during this period: history, theory, politics, even stuff on art and architecture. In 1816 he begins to write on war, which is what he is most famous for. In 1818, he will really start seriously pursuing it. He will work on it until 1830, when he boxes it up and then takes up a new command. And then eventually he will go and watch the Polish Revolt in 1831. He won't publish the book before he dies. His wife will publish it, afterward. And so we wouldn't have it. We might not have it if it wasn't for her efforts to put it together with some friends to publish it and some of his other works. Now, well, why does On War matter? Well, On War matters because of the influence that it has in the way that people think about war. And it's not a book that tells you how to fight a war. It's a book that tells you how to think about fighting a war and things that you consider and things that matter and what the reality of war is. He's trying to develop arguably a system for analysis. And so what I'm going to talk about here is just very, very briefly a couple of things about On War. I'm going to cherry pick some things, obviously, because it's a very, very large book. To Clausewitz, theory, was really very important. Having a theory, a method for approaching things. It clarified things in your mind. It puts you on a foundation, for what you want to do, a level playing field. I think C.S. Lewis said, he said, understanding the terms of your argument, knowing where that is, makes you better able to understand what you're actually talking about. And to him, theory, though, has to be realistic. Not hair-splitting, not flights of fancy. It has to be based on reality, based on experience, based upon history, particularly military theory. It's not something you just make up with this ethereal idea. It has to be something useful. And to train the mind. Now, one of the things he does in the books is, look, he's trying to set up to explain what war is. Well, what is it? And you could get different views. Obviously for him, it's a force is an inherent part of it. To think of anything less than this is delusional in his mind. But it's not a science in his view. It's an art. It's an art because there are these things you can't measure, these intangibles, the will, the spirit, courage, and so on. But there are scientific things that obviously intervene. How many men do you need? How much are they going to eat? How far can you move them? What's the ammunition going to cost you? And so on. So there are various things where you have the hard numbers, but how this all works together. Clausewitz, it's obviously war is complex. You can make an argument that war is the most complex things that people do, except maybe marriage. That might trump it a little bit, but it's only pretty close to being the best or most complex. It's a political act. Bob mentioned earlier, the famous quote from Clausewitz: "War is nothing but the continuation of policy with other means, or politics by other means." It's a political tool. And one of the things that some people argue that separate Clausewitz's theory from others is the fact that how much politics, the role of politics is. It penetrates his theory and is shot through it, and it helps to explain, what he is thinking about. Because to Clausewitz, war in reality, it's influence determined by these various things. The political factors always go on. The politics always go on, even while you're fighting. The human nature, the moral forces, the intangibles. We talked about chance, uncertainty, friction, the uncontrollable factors. The enemy gets a vote on what's going on. He calls war a true chameleon. Now, so if you were what would Clausewitz say about how do you think about fighting a war? What do you think about? What do you do before you're getting into this thing? And he would say, well, really, you have to understand the nature of it first. He said the leadership has to get this in their mind before they do anything. What kind of war is it? What is the war about? Okay, now it's easy to say, understand the nature of the war. Okay, what in the world does that mean? Well, how do you do that? Well, here's one paragraph here from Clausewitz. He says, to discover how much of our resources must be mobilized for war, we must first examine our own political aim or objective and that of the enemy. We must gauge the strength and situation of the opposing state. We must gauge the character and abilities of its government and people, and do the same in regard to our own. Finally, we must evaluate the political sympathies of other states and the effect the war may have on them. To assess these things in all their ramifications and diversity is plainly a colossal task. Now, I put this one particular paragraph up because, to me, just in this one little section, is so much that if countries or planners that are thinking about getting into a war, just examining these things can give you so much of a clue potentially as to what can happen and what you're going to need to do to fight the war. Knowing what you want, figuring out how you're going to get it, and how it's going to affect other nations, as well. Now, how else do you determine the nature of the war? Well, in his mind, first be clear in his mind what he intends to achieve. Your political objective. Get that first, then figure out how you're going to conduct it. Now, because in Clausewitz's mind, understanding what you want, everything else is going to flow from that. Rationally, it should. It may not necessarily, but ideally it should. It should flow from that. If anybody that has read any similar things, they talk about, you hear the word objectives or aims, but you hear the term ends and means. What you want, what is the end that you're hoping to get? Do you have the means to get it? Can you get to that point that you're trying to get to? Is it worth it? Is it worth what we're going to pay in blood, treasure, prestige, and so on? Do you have the power to get it? If you do, well, use the force necessary to get it. Go do what is necessary to get the job done. Now, so again, the political object for him, how it determines all of these other things. He talks about what he calls the value of the object. It says, since war is not an act of senseless passion, but is controlled by its political object, the value of the object must determine the sacrifices to be made for it in magnitude and also in duration. Once the expenditure effort exceeds the value of the political object, the object must be renounced and peace must follow. In other words, when countries go to war, they have things they want. They will only pay so much for it, in blood, treasure, other things. Once one side is unwilling to pay, he argues that, again, don't have to agree with him, but he argues somebody will make a deal, at that point. Now, he says also, well, we know our object. Well, what kind of object do we have, or political objective do we have? To Clausewitz, wars are divided into two types. There's a war fought for regime change, to overthrow the enemy regime, and then every other reason less than that. In his view, these are two different, the wars fall into these two types. Now, also, if you read the book, he will put forward this concept of absolute war. And this is confusing sometimes for people, and it leads to a lot of the criticism that you get of Clausewitz. We're saying, he says everything has to be used and war must be fought in an absolute sense. He actually says, he uses this as a theoretical construct. He puts up the idea of the absolute and says, war can't really be waged this way, meaning you're not going to use everything and everything's not going to work. Because there are these reality intervenes. People don't always do what they want, what they should do. Friction keeps you from doing what you do. You don't have the intelligence you want. It's uncertain, and so on. So he uses a theoretical concept to explain what war is really like. Now, so we've got our objective and we know the value of it. But with the paragraph I showed you, which is essentially the assessment, how do you figure out the nature of the enemy, the character of the enemy, his abilities, his military strength? Well, he puts forward some tools, arguably one of them that would be useful for this. He calls it his paradoxical, or is called his paradoxical or wondrous trinity, depending which translation you use. And he says, as a total phenomenon, its dominant tendencies always make war a paradoxical trinity, composed of primordial violence, hatred, and enmity, which are to be regarded as blind natural force, of the play of chance and probability within which the creative spirit is free to roam, and of its element of subordination as an instrument of policy, which makes it subject to reason alone. The first of these aspects mainly concerns the people. Violence, back to the French Revolution, primordial violence, passion. You have to have the passion of the people, or you want the passion of the people to help you fight the war. The second, the commander and his army. This is the creative spirit is free to roam, chance and probability. War is the realm of chance, the realm of probability. The army and its leaders have to be able to manage this. And third, the government, instrument of policy. In other words, the assumption is that the government goes to war for rational reasons. Either it's forced to defend the country, or if it's fighting an offensive war, then it has a good reason for doing it. It's not doing this just because it wants to. So it's these three forces: violence, creativity, rationality, the people, the government, the army. But he says, well, sometimes it doesn't really work this way, because sometimes governments will go to war for passionate reasons. They will not really think clearly about what they're doing and not have a clear objective. Now, so you look at the strengths, you look at the society, the military, the government, and so on, then you think, well, where am I going to land my blows? Where is my force going to be put against? And he puts forward this concept of the center of gravity, and essentially argues that countries have elements of power, elements of national power, certain key strengths. And in his view, the army, the capital, the allies, the leader, public opinion, and it depends on various different things which one matters, that one or all of these things will be key sources of strength of a nation, and ideally you should go after these if you can. The reality is sometimes you can't, and he also, with Clausewitz, will have, these are things you should do, he will say, but he will always have an exception. There's always an exception to any of his rules. You say, well, sometimes, ideally, yes, you want to go after the center of gravity, but sometimes there's an opportunity that is so great and so beneficial that you go after that, as well. There's some other objective worth pursuing. Now, so you know where you're landing your blow, you're fighting your war. How do you end the war? Well, he says, ultimately, you really want to make sure you are getting, what you want. You're preserving your state. You're trying to get ultimately a peace treaty that will resolve the conflict, and you have a settlement that hopefully you can live with, that you've paid an acceptable cost for. But that ideally that's what you want, final victory. But how do you get to that ends up being the question. You have to keep that in mind. What do you do militarily to get to this point? And again, with so much of things like this, it depends. It depends on the situation. There's no just template for fighting any war. How do you get there? You might destroy the enemy's forces. You might take his territory. You might occupy parts of him. You might do something else that will bring him around to your point of view. But what you're also hoping to get is eventually a settlement that is lasting. But he says the reality is a lot of countries and a lot of leaders, yes, they will make a deal with you, but they don't intend to keep it. For them, he calls it a transitory evil, as he says. And I think this is certainly drawn from his study of history and from his experience in the Napoleonic Wars, where the wars are fought maybe a year or two, and then you take a break, and then maybe a couple years later you fight it again. So in 1831, Clausewitz will die as a result of the big cholera epidemic that sweeps through Europe. His wife, along with some friends, will publish on war and a lot of his other works as well. And it has generally, not always certainly, but is generally considered the best theoretical work on war, the best military theory. And while there are obviously things you can argue with it against and things that some would say are obsolete, but with it, he gives us a good method for thinking about war, for doing analysis, and trying to figure out what we're doing and why. But there are, of course, other books of theory as well, and it's certainly not the only one. So, well, thank you very much, and I'll take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Is there anything Clausewitz has to say that you find has become particularly relevant in current conflicts or with current technology?
With the technology, I don't know, but but with the current conflicts, just the really having a clear idea in your mind what you want and why you are sending people there to get it. Knowing that and then saying, is it worth it? So particularly really knowing what you want, I think, is always relevant, because if you know what you want, then that arguably should spark some thought.
So would it be fair to say he was critical of mission creep?
Critical would be the wrong word, I think, to say, because the reality would be sometimes the mission will change, because sometimes the circumstances will change. But if you know what you want going in, then maybe you don't get the mission creep. But then the circumstances will change. Maybe you're forced to have mission creep.
I know it was kind of early for this, but with all of his interest in theory, do you know if Clausewitz did anything with war games or laying stuff out on tables, that sort of thing?
Honestly, I don't know. He participated in a lot of real maneuvers and real wars, but I don't know about that. I honestly don't know on that. I never caught that anywhere. But he did like counterfactual studies, where here's a problem, let's think about the various ways we can approach this problem. And here is the solution. Well, one of the things he said, if someone sets out their plan and you criticize it, you better have a better option. Because if you're just criticizing and you don't have a better choice, then so who cares what you say? You got to wonder about that.
So you talked about how he saw, say, the ongoing conflict in Europe as a way of making a career and a fact of life. But does he ever talk about the morality of it? Say if he saw where today the Swedes and Danes are no longer attacking each other for territory, would he be disappointed to hear they're no longer doing that? Would he see it as an improvement? Does he ever talk about the morality of it?
Yeah, that's interesting. The book is really, to them, war is man's natural state. in many ways. And you could argue almost that that's not, that if you look at certainly the shape of European history, it's that way. The book is a non-moral approach to war. He certainly understood the reality of it, but to him, this is the reality of it. As far as what he would say about today, I honestly, I don't know. I think he would be, like what I mentioned, what related to his question, I think the lack of clarity about what people want would always confuse him. But he would say the same thing about his own people. He criticizes his own government for not knowing what it wants, and criticizes them for their behavior afterward, in some wars, and gets himself in trouble sometimes doing it.
So two-part question. So the first is, why do you think Clausewitz's work has been so influential? And second, what are some of the real-world applications of that? Like, where in the history have we seen his influence really shape events?
As far as why, having read most of the other primary theoretical works, and we teach some others. I mean, we teach Mahan, we teach Sun Tzu, we teach Corbett's Principles of Maritime Strategy, which there are no boats in Clausewitz's world, so apparently. But the others are certainly useful. His, to me, and others would disagree certainly. To me, it gives a clarity of thought and a systemization of thought, which is useful. And plus, he does give us one of the reasons we use it to teach with it gives us terms to define things, and it gives us tools for analysis, because we can, when we're teaching one of our case studies, and we'll say, okay, what is the American center of gravity? Okay, and this gives us certain things we can look at and say, we know what center of gravities are. How do we look at the strengths or weaknesses of an enemy? It's very useful for that. As far as your second question, I'm sorry, what was your second question again? You have to repeat it to me.
Where do we see, real-world applications of his work?
Clausewitz's influence was actually slow to develop. There just wasn't that much interest in it for a very long time. The people started to take more of an interest in it after the Franco-Prussian War, 1870-71, where the Germans come out very successful in that, or the Prussians come out successful in that. And you see a general then spread of his ideas. It was fairly influential with Lenin. He liked the idea that politics, war is a political tool. He said this is clever. So you see it with some American foreign policy, but only after Vietnam. And you see it particularly in the Reagan administration. There's an argument over how you use military force. You've certainly got the post-Vietnam hangover about that, and you have certain groups in the administration that are more hawkish than others. Some want to intervene in places, some don't. And you end up, Caspar Weinberger, he says, look, he develops this Weinberger doctrine, which is very much based, some elements based upon Clausewitz's teachings, where having a clear political objective, understand the end you want, understand the means you want, make sure you have the support of the people to do this. If the people aren't supportive of it and the government isn't supportive of this, then we should really be questioning whether we're doing this and whether it's worth it. That's the best examples of the influence of it. That I think it's had more influence among military than thinking and analysis than among politicians. So. Yes?
I was wondering if you could say something about how Clausewitz's On Wars compares with, say, Sun Tzu's Art of War or Kautilya's Arthashastra. What are the points of sharpest similarity or sharpest contrast between the other works?
We actually, when we teach our theorist case study, we use Clausewitz and Sun Tzu at the same time. And so we can get them back and forth with them. One of the things that's very similar to them is both of them understanding, figure out what you're getting yourself into here. Clausewitz is he says, look, war is violence, people are going to die, it's going to be expensive, and it's going to be messy. Understand that before you go in. It better be worth it to you. Sun Tzu says the same thing. He has a passage where he tells the king, he says, look, when you go to war, it's going to cost you this, you got to raise an army like this, people are going to be mad at you, it's going to be expensive and messy, get this through your head beforehand, it better be worth it. When Clausewitz talks about his centers of gravity, Sun Tzu has his priorities of attack, and some of them are exactly the same. He talks about hitting their allies. He talks about talk about cities, but he warns against it. So there's a lot of similarities to that. Sun Tzu is much more in tune with intelligence and deception than Clausewitz is. Clausewitz is not so. He's a little more skeptical of that, than Sun Tzu. But they're really fun to study together because you get. Oh, here's what that's similar to them, but also here's where they disagree. So,
I think I have the last question myself. Pick a example, it's in the news right now. Vladimir Putin just got humiliated at the G20 and sent home for his Ukrainian adventures. What do you think his objective really is in Ukraine?
You know, I was in New York last week, and I was involved in a piece of a conversation with other people with that, and they were having an argument about that back and forth, and both the people very informed, so I don't know who to believe on it. So, what are his objectives? Probably all of Ukraine, a lot of people would say. At least the parts of the Ukraine that would allow him a land bridge to the Crimea and connect to Moldova. That's another opinion that I've heard. Another opinion that I've heard is that not only Ukraine, but Belarus. Ukraine's the first step in Belarus. And also there's a lot of fear, apparently, and this is my opinion from what I've heard, not the government, that there's a lot of fear among prominent figures in the Baltic states, about what might be. Well, that big cyber attack they launched on the Estonians a couple of years ago, and the kidnapping of the Estonian officer, and there's been a shifting of all the Polish defense forces around, but basically to look on the border with Ukraine. So, but I don't know what he wants. So I'm not a Russian expert by far.
Let's thank Dr. Stoker for coming here.
Thank you all very much.